Howdy. So we just finished Republic of Rome. Just before I played this, actually, clicked on the, or maybe after the first game or something, first little bit, first turn. I looked at the game and noticed, or maybe this is what triggered me, that Scott Nicholson did a review of it, an overview of the rules primarily. He had done a kind of, oh hey, here are some people who just played this, and here's their views on it, type of in-game type review that he does as well. But this was a very, very detailed, good explanation of the basic core of the rules, I think, if you want something along those lines. And that probably helped influence, it may have influenced my decision to play, and it certainly, I think it's a required viewing if you have a desire to look into this game, but aren't really sure, you know, what you're going to face, rather than whatever I'm going to give you. Of course, if you watch my playthrough, you get a pretty good idea of some of it, but not so much of the mechanics themselves, more the flow of the game. I tried in the early one to give you more of the mechanics. Alright, but he brought up a couple of interesting points in his review. One is that the game is just too long. Now, I'm not a person who shies away from long games, but I have to say this. I feel one of two things when I play this. Either it's too short or it's too long. And that's my continuous feeling when I play. So if you play just a single deck, I'm sure that you're walking into it with a certain expectation. But if you're playing the, you know, all these decks here, there's a feeling that it should take a significant amount of time. You should see a lot of Rome develop. And I see one of two things happening. Usually either the game ends in that first deck, even when you're playing with 3 decks, or on an occasional chance it goes as long as my game did, which is into that 3rd deck. It very seldomly ends in the 2nd deck, except maybe right at the beginning of the 2nd deck, because Rome is like, you know, trying to recover from blows from the 1st deck, and maybe a couple of wars come out, maybe an extra Punic War. I've seen all 3 Punic Wars out at once. That's just hell. But usually that 2nd deck is filled with wars that aren't very threatening, and not many of them for that matter. It's sort of this nice period where Rome gets to recover, and nobody really has the power, I think, in most of the games that I've seen, to win the game in that 2nd deck, even without my options. Now, my options make it much, much more likely that the game does not end in the 1st deck, because I'm giving out less of the initial cards in the 6-player game or the 5-player game or whatever. If you play the game in 3, you probably have that same kind of distribution, but it's more likely that one player will get enough power that they can really just dominate Rome and force the other players out of the game. So I feel like the number of cards with a large number of players is actually one of the better options, and I've brought that one into play with other people. I don't think I've brought my aging rule in with other people. That's a weird rule. I don't know if it terribly affects the balance of the play. It does tend to stretch things out because it makes it harder for us. So often you have single senators who are just very, very powerful, sitting at high influence for a large part of the game, and you can't give them offices. You have to shuttle them out to governorships, you know, and 3 turns they're out at a governorship, 1 turn they come back, then they're out at another governorship. I do not like what that does in terms of my interpretation of the historical aspect of the game, so I'm very disturbed by that. So I have to pretty much agree with him. For the type of game it is, I mean, it dragged out for me. And even in opposed play, I felt when it does go that far, you know, 10, 12 hours, sitting down for something that you're not sure whether it's going to take 2, 4, or 12 hours. That's a hard sell for me. Now, usually the few times that we've sat down and brought this out as we're going to play all 3 decks, I don't think I've ever played less than that, we had the time set aside, and I think it did go deep a couple of times, and it's still fatiguing. It's very fatiguing to sit and play something like that when you're not sure. On the other hand, when it ends in that first deck, solitaire or multiplayer, especially early, there's just this feeling of, I went through these rules for what? You know? I mean, this is a pretty hefty set of rules, and it's very, very difficult. Reading these rules is horrible. The only reason this is easy for me is I've played this enough times and fought these rules enough times that I pretty much know them. It has a good index. It has a really good index. The rest of the rules, so this is one of the other things Scott Nicholson brought up. This is Avalon Hillese. Now, this is a particularly bad case of Avalon Hill rules. This is up there with things like Magic Realm and the programmed instruction games. Hitler's War is pretty bad, although it's shorter rules. Avalon Hill did some pretty good rules too. War and Peace is pretty good, I think. Third Reich isn't bad. It had its issues too, but I find the rules always a mixed boat, and usually they just didn't settle on one format that worked well. This one, they end up going through the different phases of play, but they make it very, very dense and hard to read. And I mean, you know, you have special rules like the Cleopatra rule is just buried in this massive text. And the card more or less says it, but reading through the rules is a tough chore. The rest of the components, I think they're fine. You know, this is not up to today's standards, maybe. And I saw what the modern version looked like on that review, and I wasn't pleased with it, with its little boxes and spinners on the cards and stuff like that. I like this version better. But that may just be the old, diehard grognard in me, but those other pieces, they just look like a complexity in terms of components that this game does not need. The map also the board looked a little busier. Now, the board, he points out, is almost useless. It's sort of like this player 8 card. It is, but it does help separate things. The problem is, as you get later in the game, there's not enough space. And you saw where I had so much up here in the form section that it was just a cluttered mess. And I'm covering up some of the tables and stuff. I don't know what the answer is. I would have rather they made, I don't know. Because the game takes up a lot of table space at that point, too. I mean, you had my whole table covered for something that's kind of, it feels almost like it should be a much lighter game than it is. On the other hand, this has always been something of a favorite of mine. I've come back to it again and again. I don't rate it terribly well because I usually walk away not feeling too good after playing it. Either, geez, that ended too quickly. But usually when it does that, I play another one immediately afterwards, and it's the, boy, that's painful. Certainly my modifications make it go into that third deck a lot more often. And if you really, really want that, you might want to play around with something like I explained in, I think, the introduction. All right. What else can we say? Well, here's one that bugs me, which is the victory conditions for the game. Most specifically, the sort of console for life conditions, or maybe the 35 prestige. So, my feeling from the game is that it's supposed to span the entirety of the Republic, but historically, those victory conditions got met. Sulla, at the very least, was actually elected dictator with a completely open-ended reign. Now, because he was Sulla and he was such a dude, he resigned. And we had emperors later who resigned as well. So he won the game by the rules, he just didn't take the victory, as it were. And I don't know what to say with that. I mean, maybe he just took the dictatorship and then handed it back, even though he could have played for more. I don't know. But that's kind of disturbing to me. Likewise, there's the question of, well, yeah, Caesar was not elected, right? But he marched on Rome and successfully defeated it. So there's this kind of, the history doesn't quite jive with what you're aiming to do in the game. And that's disturbing to me, and is just sort of a bothersome thing. Overall, though, there's nothing quite like this. The only things that I can compare it to, I compare it to La Révolution Française, but my pleasure in La Révolution is much, much higher for whatever reason. I almost always walk away from that feeling pretty good about the game. I don't feel exhausted by it. It's a shorter game when it goes the full length, and there's less fiddly stuff to keep track of, less numbers, the rules. Okay, so this is scary, but I'm actually saying the Azure Wish rules, as flawed as they are, and as flawed as AWE always is, are so much more pleasant than these. These are just a nightmare to face, especially for your first time. Or, you know, so I remember in my 20s, I had played this a number of times, but coming to it and reading the rules, after having played it a couple of times and saying, wow, I don't know what's going on, whatever. But once you get into the flavor of it, the sequence of play chart is very, very useful. Here's one gripe I have. The two-player and solitaire sequence of play gives the names of the different factions. This one doesn't, so I immediately forget what they are, and I'm so tempted to just write which each faction is, because I want that for my personal flavor of it. The dynamic of this kind of, we must save Rome, and I want to try to win while I'm at it. I really like that. I really like that. I think that matches the La Révolution feeling, except that there's a bad guy in La Révolution Française. There's no bad guy here. Everybody's fighting for the same thing. They all want to be in charge of a healthy, surviving Rome, but they want to be able to establish, this dynasty forever, or whatever. I mean, the Octavian's dynasty didn't really last all that long when you look at it compared to some of the other, medieval dynasties that would come later. But I think it manages certain aspects of that conflict very directly. It's very symmetrical in the sense that everybody's got this same goal. In La Révolution, everybody's got this very different goal. They conflict, but here the conflict is over the same goal. Another game that I would say it's kind of similar to in some ways is Junta in feel, with the elections, with the trying to get some sort of power that everybody else is going after. But this is much less lighthearted, much, much more difficult to play, and there's something that Junta just doesn't have, which is this impending doom. You must work together to save Rome or France. Junta doesn't have that at all. Junta has, you must steal as much money as you can before the deck runs out. And this may get that, especially if you're playing the middle deck, where it's unlikely that you're going to win by revolting against Rome, but it's also, and it's there's not this huge threat on Rome, so it's very likely you're just playing to the end of the deck. One thing that I saw in the new version that was kind of interesting, probably a nice little game mechanic that I don't know how vital it is, but that end of game card, basically, that goes at the bottom or towards the bottom of the last deck. I like that mechanic. I don't know how that's going to work with the shuffling things into the next deck, etc. Do you have to search and find that card and pull it out? The actual play of the game. So when you go through your sequence of play, in a solitaire game, this is really tough because there's so much in the revenue phase that you have to really worry about in terms of going to each card and marking, the governors moving forward and how much revenue everybody gets and everything. When you're just running your own power, that's really, really light. And the other aspects, the mortality phase, it's just a chit draw. You find the guy, kill him, boom. The revenue phase, if each person's handling only their own revenue, it's fairly straightforward. The forum phase, damn, that's fast. I mean, that sounds like it's going to be the meat of the game. That's, but what does it come down to? It comes down to rolling dice. Do you draw a card or do you get a random event? If either one takes immediate effect, you deal with it. Otherwise, you get a card in your hand, which is why you want extra turns. You want those cards in your hand. And then if there's someone out there that you can take, you can make a persuasion attempt on them. You can try to get a night roll. You can try to you can sponsor some games, and that's it. I mean, that's what you get in an initiative. It's very, very fast, and that takes almost no time. Solitaire. Population phase, roll some dice there. It's done. Senate phase, to me, this is the actual meat of the game. This is, where all the negotiations is sort of happening and saying, oh, wait, we need to stop him. Let's form a coalition and vote for him. This is very time-consuming also, but kind of interesting when I'm playing solitaire, making those negotiations, maybe rolling some dice to see who aligns with whom. Combat phase, fairly straightforward. You add up some numbers, you roll some dice. You're probably not doing a lot of combats in a turn. Revolution phase, this is sort of a cleanup phase. You're just playing your cards, and you can make deals to trade the cards here. So there's a lot of interaction, a lot of deal making, and all this kind of cool stuff. And there's not all that much overhead. If you compare it to some of the other games that have this kind of deal making, I would say it's on about the same level as, say, a Kingmaker type game, where each player doesn't have a lot that they have to do. Most of it's really the negotiations, etc. But it's not a pure negotiations like a diplomacy game. It's also, not going to be like an Empires in Arms where you have to play through all these military actions and all this complexity and handle, an economic build phase every 3 months or whatever, and certainly not a Europa Universalis, which is sort of the extreme on that level. It really allows you mechanisms that guide the play well and get you to that deal making very well. Unlike something like what I played recently, Shanghai Trader, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of wasted garbage going on where you're rolling the dice again and again and again to see if you get to do something. Here, it's pretty straightforward. Is there something you want to do? Well, then just go do it, And then you get so much deal-making power when you hit that Senate phase. And the trading cards is also, because you're holding, maybe a statesman that somebody else wants. It's great, you can cut a deal with them, but it's dangerous to reveal what you've got. This is a game that, if you're facing it for the first time, if a whole group of people who aren't used to it are facing it, I bet you somebody wins or everybody loses pretty quickly, because you really do have to kind of have a feel for what's coming, etc. A lot of games are that way, but this one seriously is that way. Overall, I still think it's a fantastic game, but it almost always ends leaving me feeling either like I didn't get the full game in, or like I didn't want to get the full game in. That's the problem with it. I don't know a solution to that. Maybe starting in the second deck instead of the first deck would guarantee that if you played second and third deck. But yeah, I mean, I would recommend this if you get a chance to. I've had a lot of fun with it with other people, especially when Rome does collapse, because it's just so hilarious. You know, you're struggling so hard and it just ain't working. All right. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this one.